only doing this one because I have to. I want to make that absolutely clear. I decided to look at all the Dalek stories because I felt there were so many fascinating ones to look at, but that entailed looking at the dogshit ones as well, something I accept but nevertheless don't have to be happy about. If it wasn't for that I wouldn't be touching the story with a barge pole, not because it's bad, although it is, because it's just one of the most tedious stories ever to have been put on the screen. It's a writer who doesn't give a shit, tossing over scripts for a production team who clearly just wants to be done with the show, and the results from that are pretty bloody predictable. And yet, there's nothing entertaining or interesting about its failures. There are a few mostly bizarre exceptions, but apart from that, it's just flat and boring. I'll say this now, this is the worst Dalek story of the whole entire classic series, and one of the worst of the whole classic run. I will of course speak in detail about why, the weak unfocused plots, the cardboard cutout characters, the appalling dialogue, terrible pacing, but the main thing is just how absolutely clear that there is nobody involved with this who gives it anything approaching a shit. The script makes it beyond blatant terroration, could not give half a shit about it. A tired and burnt out production team puts a definition of bland onto the screen, and even the usually faultless John Pertwee is clearly extremely tired and letting his dislike of the Daleks shine through his performance. It's Doctor Who, made not to tell a story or do anything interesting, but it's just with the sole purpose of getting 4 episodes of television onto the screen and nothing else. The desire sometimes to throw the Daleks in because they're popular is a recurring theme with less than impressive Dalek stories, and you'd think there'd be no better example of it than this story. That was certainly the impetus behind having a Dalek story in the first place, the original draft didn't feature them. But this doesn't really feel like that in terms of the story content itself, because there are actually interesting possibilities to do with the Daleks here, but nothing is done with them. The Daleks powerless, needing to deal with others to survive. It's an interesting potential, definitely. It might as well not be a feature of the story in the final product though. This wasn't a Day of the Daleks type thing where the story doesn't really fit them. It should in theory, but it doesn't purely because the words are not there on the page. And yeah, as I said, the original draft didn't feature them, but that's not a problem as long as they were incorporated properly into the final version, which they weren't. I will say one thing for this story though, as absolutely terrible as it is, at least it's only 4 episodes. Imagine if this shit was stretched out to 6, as was often the case. Thank heaven for small mercies. To consider the production side of the story does require understanding where the series was for season 11. The Pertwee era production team was tired, burnt out, and wanted out. Pertwee himself can be seen on the screen as the most obvious example of this, but producer Barry Letts and script editor Terence Dix were the most important on the production side as well. This was to be all of their last seasons, bar the first story of the next one to ease a new team in for Letts and Dix, and preparation for the transition was already being made. The next script editor Robert Holmes was in fact shadowing Dix for this story. It was therefore not surprising that, yeah sure, whatever, throw the Daleks in for 3 ratings was the attitude taken, and it very much shows in the final product. Director Michael E. Briant is perhaps the person who's trying the most to make this work, and he's doing the best he can here. He's a director with quite a bit of Who pedigree. He directed The Robots of Death, for instance, so that's definitely not to be sniffed at. He's doing what he can for sure. For instance, there are quite a few interesting camera angles throughout. He uses for the first time a lot of Dalek POV shots, for instance, which add a bit of interesting dynamism to it. There are telesnaps indicating this was all tried in the Power of the Daleks, but we can't see it, so it doesn't count, sorry. On the other hand, though, he's trying to make something out of total shit and it shows. Graham Harper at his finest couldn't make the endless walking through the city corridors entertaining, or do anything with the appalling chases in the first episode, which is just a pantomime level at times. The Exelons start attacking the Doctor and Sarah, which goes on forever, never has the tiniest sense of menace or creepiness at all, and just becomes farcical at points. I mean, yeah, that says it all, doesn't it? Also, there are some elementary errors as well. The first cliffhanger is among the very worst of the whole series.
The Earth creatures are to be exterminated! Fire at my command!
Wait a minute! Wait! You can't!
Total extermination! Fire! Fire! Fire!
Like, yeah, it really could not be clearer the Dalek guns aren't working, which is sort of against the idea of the cliffhanger, which is supposed to have something which will then be revealed as the resolution, not during the fucking cliffhanger itself. I don't really blame Brian for these bits because, as I said, Prime Harper is not making the story entertaining, but it doesn't change how pathetic what is on the screen is. Overall, he's probably the person least to blame for this particular disaster, but he hasn't really done much to help overall. As for the rest of it, I mean, there are a few bright spots. The model work of the city is not bad at all, and I think the design of the Daleks here, particularly their colour schema, is actually a notch above how they usually look in the 70s and most of the 80s. but most of it is also unimpressive and stinks of laziness. The set design is dull and generic, the city looks more like the inside of a Premier Inn than an ancient living city, and in some of the sequences in Part 1, the transition between the location and studio scenes is laughable in how little like each other they look, and in particular how fake the studio scenes look. The location scouting was lazy and is just an unbelievably generic BBC quarry. And as for the music, well, much has been said about it over the years, so I won't be redundant. I'll simply say this is the worst music score in the entire series history. Never has there been anything more atmosphere killing than this bizarre, messy crap, which is only not the case as frequently it is because there's no atmosphere to kill. Sometimes bizarre Doctor Who scores can be very effective. The Sea Devils is an example of one I like, but that was atmospheric electronic music, not bashing at a xylophone and blowing the wrong way down a flute like they're doing here. This is just awful. A quick note, part 1 of this story is the final story chronologically that does not exist on its original broadcast tape. The few seconds at the end of part 3 are the Deadly Assassin notwithstanding. The episode was wiped not long after broadcast, and after the junking ended in 1978, was briefly a missing episode before an NTSC copy was recovered from North America. A lower quality and edited PAL tape was recovered from Australia shortly afterwards, while today's master copy is a PAL copy that returned from the United Arab Emirates in the early 90s. The present copy is pretty much indistinguishable quality-wise from a full broadcast master. I doubt you'd notice if I hadn't told you, but it's still an interesting milestone that's worth commenting on, especially given the missing stories we had to sit through earlier on in this Dalek look. And well, we take anything that might possibly be interesting when it comes to this story. So we now get to the script, written by Mr. Terry Nation yet again, and watching this I just cannot believe he gave even the tiniest shit about writing this at any point in the process, because it's among the dullest, least interesting bits of crap anyone ever wrote for the series. Everything is just thrown in without any thought, depth or development. It's just a collection of ideas and nothing else, and even they're not really impressive most of the time. It's a bit of a theme with Nation, of course, but what gets me irritated about this is that when he really wanted to, he could do it. Remember, the next Dalek story is Genesis of the Daleks. Spoilers for my take on that story, it's one of the best stories of the whole classic run, and there he gets it so right, including elements he did so wrong here. He does absolutely nothing with Sarah's character in this story, for instance, and yet uses it so effectively in that story. So, I have to come back to the conclusion he was phoning it in for the paycheck, and phone it in he does. Let's take a look at the individual elements, shall we? It's difficult to talk about the Third Doctor in his final season without considering John Pertwee's exhaustion and burnout with the role, and in particular his disillusionment with the whole thing following the death of Roger Delgado the previous year. He was not an actor who particularly wanted to be here, and especially with his well-known and vocal dislike of the Daleks, and it's not surprising his performance in the story is very much not up to his usual standards. It's even less surprising when you consider how he's written. The Doctor's character here is just a cardboard cutout. The Third Doctor's strong moral compass and tenacity, it's completely absent. He feels like he's capable of expositing and not much else. I mean, at various points he seems both in favour and against the humans allying up with the Daleks, and the human stuff where old Scottish man is acting so immorally, in theory anyway, we're just told that, but we'll get to that. That would have been the perfect foil for him to his usual moral self, but he's not present for any of that stuff, which has also belied the fundamental issues with the story. There's no arc or journey here, it doesn't play into anything else. He just finishes the story staring at this decaying city like he thinks something wonderful has been lost, when that idea has simply never been portrayed in his character throughout the story. It's therefore not a big surprise Pertwee seems bored and zoned out throughout, and who can blame him, he has absolutely nothing to work with. Sarah Jane Smith was of course a new companion at this point, and the few teething problems with characterisation was not completely to be unexpected. The problem, however, is that it feels like it's not the case of the wrong character, it's just a case of no character. Sarah is written here as a companion archetype, and that's it. She screams and gets captured and makes alien friends, only for the Doctor to do all the actual work with them, etc. and so forth. It's just a stereotypical female companion at its most basic, and it's all the worse because Sarah was not this, and she indeed developed in her first two stories to be different from this, and her character would be different from this throughout her time on the series. At the very least, Elisabeth Sladen is new and keen to prove herself and gives a more energetic performance than most of those around her, and she is always great no matter what, but I get the feeling that Nation just didn't even bother with her here. And as I said earlier, Nation would write for her again the next season, and very much get it, which shows this wasn't some fundamental issue with her character or anything, it was just tossed off because, well, he could. As for the supporting characters, well, we'll leave the Exelons aside for now and focus on the human characters, even though I use the term characters very, very loosely. These group of humans who have been forced down to Exelon looking for MacGuffinite are a bunch of both walking cliches and so utterly lacking in any life or depth you wonder why Nation even bothered giving them names. And thus I will honour this approach by giving them nicknames, although given how little there is to say they won't be used very often. There's the Woman, whose most important character trait is that she's a woman. She's supposedly a scientist, but there's nothing about how that would affect her experience as an Exelon or a character or anything like that. She's just there to fill out some plot functions and scream at things when Sarah is otherwise engaged. Then there's the blokes, one of whom is a generic good guy character, the other is a generic authority figure who wasn't originally meant to be one, whose random death about 20 minutes after he's first introduced is basically the only non-cliche nation can muster for this lot. And there's the original commander who exposits briefly and dies. If this sounds like a lot of old shallow nothings of characters, well, draw your own conclusions. But the worst one here is Old Scottish Man, who's just the poster child of haphazard and badly done character arcs. He starts out a bit grumpy and monotone, and we're somehow supposed to think that this guy is actually some morally bankrupt and frankly dangerous man, especially when the dying commander tells him he's exactly that. Because that's good storytelling, isn't it? Having a character tell us through exposition that this character is actually a complete monster, when really he's just been a moody git the whole time. He then spends most of the rest of the story working with the Daleks and being a grumpy arsehole. Now yes, he acts like an arsehole throughout, not least the whole using slave labour thing, but you still do not remotely get the impression that this is some morally bankrupt and dangerous man. He's just a bit of a twat. And well, it doesn't work because there's nothing to it, there's no motivation to anything he does or arc he goes through or any deeper meanings. We're just told that he's an absolute disgrace of a man and see a grumpy arsehole instead. Oh, and at the end he decides to give his own life to destroy the Daleks because... well, your guess is as good as mine. There were opportunities here, and probably develop redemption back to the good side, or perhaps, he stays in his arsehole in his ways and wants to destroy the Daleks purely out of spite for them treating him as they did. But no, he changed his size because the script says so. Maybe one of those things was the idea, but there's so little depth to it, it's impossible to tell. It's just lazy and weak character building. Speaking of lazy and weak, the Exelons. Now, as a society, this is flat and cliche-ridden. They're mostly a caricature primitive society which does sacrifice and all that. But with some good guys who are clearly the good guys because they're against all that stuff and we just take their word for it. It's been done about 1,000,000 billion times and never quite as flat and uninteresting as it's done here. We only have any kind of contact at all with one Exelon, Belial, who is a generic helps the Doctor type character with absolutely nothing to him. His job is to accompany the Doctor through the shit stuff in the city and does absolutely nothing interesting while doing it. Meanwhile, the Exelon civilization, which was commented on but not explored in the first 2 episodes, more or less disappears from the story once the city stuff is involved, and the Daleks start the enslaving, which once again shows how little thought went into it. A great deal of palaver went on over the sacrifices, but, only through dry exposition and not any further explanation, and then he basically disappears in the second half of the story, which really shows the approach the story takes. Add stuff without thinking about how you should add stuff. I don't really have much else to say about the Exelons other than the stuff to do with the city and all that, because, well, they're just generic and boring, and what else is there to say? The approach to the city and the power drain also shows another frustration I have with this story, and there's actually a great deal of potential here. I like the idea of the city plot, that this ancient city is actually alive and we see inside it, see how it operates and what it would mean. Likewise, the power drain has enormous amounts of potential, especially regarding the Daleks, which we'll get to towards the end. Guess how much of that potential is actually used? You get one guess. The city plot is amongst the most tedious bits in the whole of the classic series, as the Doctor and Belial wander through the previously mentioned premiering corridors, and occasionally solve some dull puzzles, and scenes to make you realise that the puzzle scenes in Pyramids of Mars are astonishing in not being as shit as this, if this was the best they could do. This of course leads into the infamous floor cliffhanger to part 3, which has been lambasted beyond all belief by others over the years, and you don't need me to repeat any of it here. All I'll say is it's probably the most entertaining moment of the story only because of how utterly, hilariously awful it is, as opposed to drab and soul-sucking like most of the rest of it. Eventually the Doctor and Belial reach for Brain and fiddle about with some technobabble and then get attacked by these glorified mummies, which is a pathetic attempt to make the city seem living without actually exploring it at all, making it all seem not at all worthwhile, and well, it's not. Because, as I said, this idea is fascinating. A living city, all that might mean, and all that city might have experienced, and what it means for the Exelons and all that. But there seems to be no interest in doing that. Its destruction at the end of the story, complete with some absolutely bizarre screaming, I might add, is treated by the Doctor as a bit of a shame, and that's it, without regard for how this thing's destruction might affect the Exelons and the planet. It's once again indicative of the approach the story takes. A bad one. Then there's the power drain plot, which to me is the most frustrating part of the whole damn story. There's so much potential here, not least for the Doctor actually. I'm mostly going to talk about the Daleks in this bit, but the Doctor, remember, has to essentially watch the TARDIS die here. The story treats it as though he's a bit miffed by the inconvenience, and he moves on to other things that happen throughout the story. And by God, I can't believe I'm doing this, but compare the 10th Doctor's reaction in the Cyberman two-parter from Series 2 to his, with his belief that the TARDIS is dead, to the 3rd Doctor's irritated indifference here, and, well, this phrase is not used very often, so savour it. NuWho wins hands down there. But that's not the main point. The main potential here is with the Daleks. Because one of the few good lines from the story are the Doctors immediately after the Daleks arrive.
Well, well, well. Daleks without the power to kill. How does it feel?
And that's the essence of what's happening here, or at least what should be happening. This is the Daleks suddenly at their most vulnerable and their most desperate. Only in Power has anything quite like this happened before, and that was a different scenario entirely. The Daleks quite quietly and ruthlessly working to regain their power, whereas here they have no such quiet advantage. They are as stuck as everyone else and cannot simply intelligently bide their time as they did there. This is a golden opportunity to explore the Daleks and what they are in a way that was just as successfully as was done in Power, but differently. It's simply a way to show what the Daleks are at their core. Because obviously they'll be looking to scheme in a way to destroy everyone else, that's what they are, but there are layers to it. In the story itself, they agree to a haphazard alliance almost immediately, where, as I said, the Doctor was both for and against, depending on the point in the conversation, and then it's exploded to us that the Daleks are actually going to be untrustworthy. Wow, who could have seen that coming? They then proceed to spend the entire story doing Dalek-y things anyway. They enslave the Exelons, bully around the humans, who clearly have no need for anyway, and in the story's greatest mistake in my view, they get guns built into them pretty soon after arriving, thus giving them weapons and negating the story's best selling point for them. As well as asking the question of why the fucking hell the Daleks would have shotguns lying around on their ship in the first place. All the potential is thrown away just to give us generic Daleking. For instance, I think the silly hand wave about psychokinetics or whatever it is, that's about them being able to move, that should have been jettisoned, and as soon as we see the Daleks a power drain, which as we saw with the TARDIS earlier could be gradual, their ability to move is soon lost. Therefore, they're the ones desperate for an alliance with the humans, because otherwise they can't move, and they need the humans to provide them with the means to move, whether that be some mechanical means or hell just pushing them around. This can therefore be the basis of a very equal relationship between the two sides, where the humans need the Daleks' scientific expertise, but the Daleks need the humans to move. This should show us what happens when the Daleks are truly forced to adapt, when no scheming is possible because, well, they can't move and they have no weapons. Until the power is turned on, they have literally no bargaining against the humans, and they know it. This is something that would never have been seen before, and can show us Dalek intelligence and ingenuity in a completely different way. It's just a small part of what could have been done instead of the Daleks are doing Dalek things, but now with shotguns, which is what we actually get. The Daleks themselves also rarely look quite as pathetic, and given last time we saw them literally being pushed around into those ice pools, that's quite impressive. More than one is beaten to death by sticks. Yes, really, the Exelons with sticks and spears beat to death a Dalek. Yes, I know, the Dalek has no weapons, so it can't fight back, but their casing should be strong enough that beating it with a stick should not cause it to set on fire, but nevertheless it seems that's not the case here. They're also destroyed by the weird weapon from the city in a "if we blow them up, surely the Daleks will look strong" thing, which, no, that hasn't worked before, and funnily enough, it's not working now. Oh, and in the worst example of this, one decides to tell the woman to stay in one place, just by telling her to stay here, and it's absolutely shocked when she escapes by the extremely clever planning of walking away. And then it self-destructs because it has failed. Frankly, with competence like that on display, it's no wonder they were defeated by some primitives with sticks and an old Scottish bloke hiding in the cupboard. I just cannot fathom the idea of taking the Doctor's most powerful known enemies and making them out to be so pathetic, and by their creator no less. The opportunity here with the power drain was to show how the Daleks were threatening and dangerous even when they were without their weapons. Instead we see how absolutely fucking useless they are, even when they've only made the minor change of removing the energy weapons and bolting on shotguns instead. It's frankly easy to see why everyone involved with the series, including Nation, decided to go with a complete reset for the next Dalek story, because frankly, between the three Pertwee Dalek stories, with Dare the Daleks is maybe a little unfair given it was the production, not the writing side, but it still counts. Their brand has just been completely ruined. They were completely pathetic and everyone knew it. And well, if sitting through this drivel is the price to get us Genesis, well, it's a deal I'll have to take. I'll be damned if I have to be happy about it, though. Finally, I want to briefly touch on the story structure, which, hold on to your hats here, is very bad. The pacing is appalling, going from nothing happening in most of Part 1 to Part 2 going like Speedy Gonzales from the power plot to the city plot via the sacrifice plot. The chase through the quarry stuff in Part 1 mentioned earlier is just painful, and a better structure would have jettisoned it entirely, or at least minimised it, because, well, a better structure would have meant it wasn't necessary, and that's just one example. For instance, why is so much of the plot explained in dry exposition? Oh, and I haven't really touched on this, but the dialogue in this story is appalling. Like, this is Moffat level bad. And that should tell you something. But yeah, why is so much of the plot like this? Because the story is structured so that showing is impossible, and we have to tell instead. So much time is wasted. We can't show the human's backstory or why Old Scottish Man is such a danger or anything about Blough's movement. We just have to explain it to the audience in awkward exposition. Also, for instance, why is the entire city plot just wandering around with occasional things happening? Because there isn't any depth to explore further, and it's been given way too much time for what's actually there on the page. It's just poor. It's thrown together without care to create a dull and tedious experience. This story is a complete mess and one of the worst Dalek stories, full stop. The characters are weak, the plot barely functional, the structure and dialogue is appalling, the ideas are not remotely explored, and the Daleks themselves are a pathetic shadow of what they had been in the power of the Daleks. The fact that this is the last conventional Dalek story before Genesis shows how little anyone, and as we have seen this includes their creator, had any idea what to do with him anymore. It's a frankly pathetic display all round, and showed that this was a production team that was tired and burned out and had a writer who barely cared. If Nation had not written Genesis, this would have been one of the most pitiful falls from grace in the show's history, from writing the Daleks with such energy and drive in their final years to tossing this off. Only by giving him an idea he could be passionate about and work with was his fortunes, and those of the Daleks revived. This is the nadir of the Daleks in the classic series, and not only were they until they were going around New York where their leader turned into a guy with a vagina for a head did they seem quite so pathetic. What started with a cold and creepy reveal in the Dalek City way back has now come full circle. It would take starting at the beginning again to revive the Daleks, and well, next time we look at the Dalek story, we'll find out how that went, won't we? I'm giving this story a final score of 2 out of 10. The worst Dalek story of the classic series, no question. Awful plots, terrible structuring, weak characters, bad dialogue, and mostly tired production. All leads to this being a story to forget. Season 11 was mostly a weak one, indicative of how the Pertwee era production team had come to the natural end of their time on the show and they all knew it, but this is the shining cherry of shit on top of that particular cake. The Daleks feel like they're at their most pointless here, in the story only because they drew ratings, and that is a double punch when the potential I mentioned is considered. This is a complete pile of shit with very little redeeming features. Avoid. Well, April's Fool's Day is coming up in 2 weeks, and then we'll look at one of the few classic stories actually worse than this one. Yes, last year we looked at the worst of NuWho, this year it's the worst of Classic Who. God help me.